We have so many stories in our lives, but our stories are not always heard. On the Hear My True Story podcast, we tell our own true stories.
Before the white car parked, our head teacher had scattered. Looking at him, I could only see his tie that was flying backwards, waving at us, and he disappeared in thin air.
I want to share my life story. I want to share my voice with the people because I know that just a small joke I can tell through this podcast, it will make someone smile.
When you ask me what I fear most in life, I would definitely respond to you and say it's fear itself.
We are fighting for togetherness. We are fighting for equal rights. We are fighting to end injustice.
You don't have to be a storyteller or writer because, guess what? Life writes the best stories.
Hear my true story.
This is your favorite time of the week with your number one podcast.
Hear my true story.
Hello, our dear listeners. Thank you so much for coming to the Hear My True Story podcast. It is me, your host, Otako. This week, we continue our conversation with Kagayi Ngobi. Yes, if you have not listened to the first episode with Kagayi Ngobi, that was part 1 of the conversation, then part 2 of the conversation, then there's also part 3 of the conversation, and this is part 4, the last episode of the conversation with Kagayi Ngobi. This time, we dig deep into his tours that he has made in Europe and other parts of the world as a writer, as a publisher, as a theater director, as an artist in general. I hope you enjoy this wonderful conversation as we continue to know more about his work and his experiences that he's sharing with our listeners.
Welcome to a brand new episode. Hear my true story.
Yeah. Yes, my good friend Kagayi Ngobi, could you maybe introduce yourself again for our dear listeners?
Otako, thank you so much for having me. I am equally excited to be featuring on the podcast this week. My name is Kagayi Ngobi, and I am a poet. That is what I do for a living.
I would like to ask you, Kagayi, what are some of your tours you have done around? Have you had an opportunity as an artist, a poet, to do tours?
Oh yes, I have. Just this month, I was in Germany, Berlin, touring with a play called Ground Control. Last year, again, we were touring in schools with a play called Romeo and Juliet in Kampala, again, this time in Cologne, and we shall be back this year, next month. Again, Romeo and Juliet in Kampala is a play that I wrote with my friends, Ugandanizing Shakespeare. And then you and I have also been to the Africolon Festival, or the play that is based on the book, the headline that morning, that was called The Audience Must Say Amen. I've also been to Norway, touring with a play that I wrote with another team of friends of mine that we called Balilwana. It was about the refugee crisis in Africa. And also, I've been to Nairobi as well, again to tour with the play The Audience Must Say Amen. Yeah, so those are some of the places I've been to. Okay,
wow. So it means you have been in Europe, Africa, as a performer, at the same time as a publisher, touring around. Yeah, wow, that's really nice. I mean, I like as I'm also a performer, an artist. Whenever I see African productions coming to Europe, I really tend to follow them if I am able to follow some of them and watch them. But I also like supporting African content when they come to Europe to tell their own stories. our stories as Africans should be told by Africans. Yeah.
Yes.
So now I want to ask you, someone who has toured around Europe, what was your experience as a poet, an artist, a publisher in Europe?
Well, first and foremost, poetry is not as popular anywhere in the world. Yes, for me, that's the first thing, that poetry is not that popular, especially in theater. I used to think it was just a Ugandan experience. That for me, that's the first experience. The second experience, which also it took me by surprise, but a pleasant surprise, is that our poems, even when we write them and about the social and political cultural conditions in our country, they have a universal appeal. People around the world, face the same challenges. We might change the names of the places and the context. No, we might change the names and the places, but the context of emotion is the same. The frustration they feel, the disappointment that the government has toward people feel towards the governing systems, it is the same. In fact, most people tend to think that wherever I recite my poems, that is where I come from, and I have to tell them, no, I actually come from a country in East Africa called Uganda. That's what I was writing about. Yeah, so that was a pleasant surprise to know that the poems have a universal appeal. And then also, as a publisher, of course, I am aware that in Europe, they don't have much access, or they don't have much access to African books. So the African stories is still skewed with the racisms and the stereotypes that were produced by books that were written in the 70s, the 80s, the 60s, and whatnot. I think it's important that that Europe and Africa find a margin for them to know what stories are coming out of Africa today, the contemporariness of them, so that they can also let go of the stories of hunger, the stories of HIV/AIDS, you know what I mean. The stories of you know what I mean. Even when the story is not as pleasant, but at least it is being told in a contemporary way. Yeah.
Make sure to leave a review. This makes our day and fuels future episodes. Hear my true story.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I mean, stories that have been told with the colonial perspective of Africa being independent on Europe, or Africa being really a poor place, Africa being a place for people who don't have clothes, Africa being a place for people who can't afford to even write or publish a book. But then when our dear listeners listen to a very prominent poet, publisher and writer in Uganda, East Africa, that inspires so many other African people living in Europe to look for such books of African writers and publishers and also support them. Yeah, and then you have mentioned about racism, and then I want to ask you for this. You are free to answer or not. Have you ever, as a performer in Europe, wherever you were, confronted by racism? You are free to answer or not.
Of course I have. Of course I have. And I remember my first day at the theater where we were working just last month. Perhaps I was too black for the for the guy at the gate, for him to imagine that I had come to the Maxim Gorky Theater to work there. I was stopped from entering, and he was, of course I don't speak German, unfortunately, but you could tell that he was telling me, you're not supposed to be here, while he was letting everyone else get in, and of course I'm always, I prefer to be polite, even when I face prejudice. So I just let him speak the German, and then somebody who translated came around, and I think it is called racial profiling. I was racially profiled, to be in the place. I did not file a complaint. I take pity on people who judge people by their skin colors or something like that. I found it unnecessary, really. And of course, I've also been, tracked by the police for one reason or the other, at night. But still, like I said, I always prefer to remain calm, and I let them, ask me the questions, and then I just go my way. I see it, I sense it, and I don't know. I take pity. I take pity on such people. Yeah.
Okay. I really understand you. I'm living in German, and I can really relate with what you're talking about, racial profiling. I mean, people judging you by your color, but it's not right. That's what I can only say.
Of course it is not.
Yeah, but as a writer and a publisher, what could you do for such a thing? Because I'm sure racism, we talk about it here in Europe, but maybe back home, people don't know about it, that these things happen.
No, actually, racism is a universal problem. Racism is not an attitude. Racism is a system. Racism is a system of privilege, And so in our country, it manifests through tribalism, and people, where we judge others based on, what, again, the colonialists taught us to call tribes, and we privilege others based on that. And so for me, it is not any different from, judging somebody by the color of their skin. So in where we come from, like I said, for me it is the same problem, and I treat it the same way. I don't know. I use my platform as a poet to write about these things, to perform about them, and hopefully that somebody listens and their mindset is changed. For me, I use my platform to express myself about these issues. So I write my poems, I write my plays, and these are the themes that I deal with every day. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing your personal experience with being confronted by racism. So I would like to ask you another question. What would you tell a young poet around the globe that would like to publish a book, maybe tour around the globe with their art? What can they consider to do? I mean, what can they do to be there and move from one continent to another as publishers, writers, poets?
Yeah, I think the drive to share your story, you must have the drive to want to share your story in so many forms. For me, I always wanted to share my story through theater. I wanted to share my stories through books, and I wanted to share my stories through poetry. And so the opportunities that I always looked out for were the kind that were in theater, they were in publishing, and they were in poetry. So if you're out there and you want to, for me, I don't think you should look at the end of it. Of I want to tour, of course it's not bad to wish for that, but I think this art that we serve is bigger than us, and it is the message that carries you. You don't carry the message. So if the focus is on the message, the people that need it will invite you. The places where it needs to go will call to you. For me, the first time I stepped on a plane was because of poetry. I didn't even have a passport by the time I got the invite, and I had to find a way of getting it, and it's been the same up to now. It is the message gets, when you are consistent with your message and you put it there in the forms that you have decided you want to share it. Yes, the places that the message gets to will call to you. And for me, the bit about that is that it will be on your terms. You don't have to sell your soul or to sell out your art. Yeah, so stick to the message. Keep working hard at it. Find the avenues that are right for you. Not everyone will use theater. Find the avenue that works for you. Use it. Put your work out there. Focus on the message.
So, thank you so much for that recommendation. If I may ask, let me just ask, maybe I don't know. Where can someone listen to your poetry? Do you have an online format where someone can pay to listen to your poetry? Just like the people listen to stories, people listen to these podcast conversations on their mobile phones, on their computers, on their laptops. Do you have a platform?
No, not really. At least not yet. Because for us to do theater work, it's highly discouraged to upload your work, because most festival managers and producers want it to go to spaces where people can only access it in the physical form. So yes, there are some videos of me on YouTube where I have performed at various conferences and spaces, but most of my major works are not accessible online. Because that's the business. That's the business. I mean, people access it in theater.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that means when someone is not able to find you in theater, they can't listen to your poetry.
Not at the moment. That I can say, not at the moment.
For that, I would like you to really say your last words and maybe say bye to the listeners.
My last word is bye.
I know you can say bye in our language, you know. You can say, how many languages do you speak? How many languages, I mean, I had forgot this, but how many languages do you do your poetry in? Is it English or are there other languages that you do?
I do in English, Luganda, and Lusoga.
So could you maybe say bye in 1, 2, 3 languages from Uganda?
Mweraba, tusisinkana oluddako, bana tunairamu, tugolwire, basabira nikisamiire.
Thank you so much. Ndi musanhufu ino kubanga nkuchaziza podcast eno. Our dear listeners, I'm saying in Lusoga that I'm happy to have hosted Kagayi. Musoga is also Musoga from Uganda, Eastern Uganda, and it's quite always wonderful to hear these wonderful conversations on this podcast, mainly telling stories by fellow Ugandans, maybe other people, not only Ugandans, but all over the world that have their own stories to share. We are always happy. And for that reason, I would like also to say bye for now, and we shall be there on our next episode. Thank you.
We not only have voices for a podcast, but also faces for YouTube. Don't miss your next episode. Hear my true story.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, Music by Edwin Matovo, hosted and produced by Otako. Subscribe to our podcast for more stories and visit us on our website, hearmytruestory.com, for more stories. All the links are listed in the show notes of this podcast.